Hello, class. We are going to go into the aftermath of the rating and trading economic system uh, that the Vikings used to enrich themselves, and culturally significant uh, finds came out of this second period. A little background on it for those of you who might have forgotten some aspects of the Viking rating and trading economic system. Uh, Basically, the Vikings wouldn't have seen the rating part of it as anything different from the trading part of it. Would have been like going to the store, except that they were killing and robbing. Uh, but the big question here is not so much that, but that um, what happened afterward. I'm not talking about well afterward, like what we're going to be getting into today or continuing on after the Faroe Islands and Iceland and some of the other places in the North Atlantic that the Vikings may have gone post raiding and trading economic system. But what did they do after they were done raiding? Well, obviously, as we've talked about before, they set up puppet governments and basically become taxmen. I think the best and largest, certainly, um, example of this is the Great Heathen Army, the battles that took place starting in East Anglia and moved west, as we've already discussed, to Northumbria and Mercia. And so what happened was the army wound up splitting into two. Uh, Mostly it was because of activity happening in the south. The Wessex armies cutting the two armies off. But also the Southern Army continued a little further west they should have and came back around, which was actually good militarily, but uh, bad at the same time because they were cut off from the Northern Army. Uh, which was actually fine with the Northern Army as they essentially became taxmen. And they put puppet rulers in. The puppet rulers paid the Vikings to not kill them more. And that went on for a very long time until they got bored with it. Ivar the Boneless, of course, is famous for getting tired of it. He, with Olaf, set up the Dublin Kingdom, which was a Viking kingdom in Ireland, or today's Ireland. And others got tired of it. Eventually, they either settled or or went back to Denmark or Norway. Um, this is interesting because basically the people of these former free lands, well, as free as they were allowed to be anyway, were under constant pressure to supply enough commodities to the puppet king so he could pay the Vikings to not kill him and depose him and put somebody else on the puppet throne. So, uh, so basically, what happened was this raiding and trading economic system continued into essentially a taxman trading system, which is brilliant. They didn't have to expend forces and human lives, but it caused cultural problems. These people lost their identities, and although they did adapt and they became more Viking, if there is such a thing. Of course, there wasn't such a thing, as that word didn't exist. This was the first example of a large scale coalition of these chieftains. Um, so, but anyway, we know this. We have already studied this. But how did this continue without the raiding and trading part? Because when they settled in, when the Vikings settled in the Faroe Islands and other islands north of Britannia and on Iceland, there were either no one there or very few people. Of course, famously on Iceland, there were some Irish monks there that the Vikings ran roughshod on. was probably the last example of a raiding and trading economic system taking place as they moved further west. Though there wasn't a lot of raiding, as these were pious monks who had taken vows of silence, so they didn't really have much, if anything. Who wasn't killed escaped the island. I can't imagine that they were very successful in a dinghy, if they even had that. There really isn't much known. We know that some of them certainly were killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles talks about the vicious Norsemen coming and killing the monks, but we don't know if they all actually died. But this system continued. This was an economic system more than anything. In places that the Vikings went after Iceland, further west of Iceland, of course, Greenland, and North America with Vinland, and we'll get into Vinland a little bit more on the next module as we're continuing the travels west to follow the Vikings in their economic endeavors. So initially, when they settled in 985, give or take 1 or 2 years before or after, they set up what was familiar to them, a farming and ranching culture. And this was common. This is something that they did on England, as we've discussed before, in England and France and wherever they settled, even down the Danube, and the Viking Rus, of course, which we won't be talking about in this class. But they would farm. They would do what they did. These were farmer raiders, as strange as that sounds. And this same thing happened in Greenland. Of course, it was a little different because, of course, they didn't have to raid anyone. They came looking to settle, looking for something that resembled peace anyway. What they found was when they got here that it wasn't a great fertile place. They were able to grow some barley and some other things, hardier things, although as the mini ice age set in sometime after 1200, maybe even a little earlier for the beginnings of that, farming became impossible. In fact, eventually, even ranching became not necessarily impossible. We can see through the archaeological data on Greenland that they switched over from a meat-eating society, strictly a meat-eating society, to a fish, walrus, seal-eating society, and so that was a big change. But that wasn't until later. You started seeing some in their garbage pits. You started seeing some fish bones in there, certainly by 1250, definitely after 1300. So what happened on Greenland? Well, for more than 100 years, well more than 100 years, in fact, probably closer to 150 years, they continued this same subsistence farming and ranching. There was some after they went to Vinland, but most of them came back to Greenland. They had started a timber industry, which was actually very lucrative at the start. And they sold, for the most part, to Iceland until the Iceland colony decided, hey, let's cut out the middlemen. Let's go to North America ourselves. And that's what they did. But what the Vikings did, as resourceful as they are, they started hunting for walrus and walrus tusks and their coats as well, and other animals' coats. And these were in very high demand in Europe. And so they made a killing for 150 to 200 years. As generations of the Vikings got very wealthy on this new economic practice. Of course, then the hunting season got shorter because the mini ice age had set in. So that started to affect things. But the big thing for the Vikings economically, they were affected by the elephant tusk trade in North Africa. As some of the routes opened up in North Africa, elephant tusks became cheaper to acquire. And of course, this ivory, whether it was via the walrus or the elephant, was in great high demand for European jewelry. The kings and queens and princesses and princes all wanted ivory. And so the Vikings started losing out. And this was the start of a slow progression towards, well, not extinction, but certainly towards the end. And the end is interesting. Um, in the Eastern settlement, uh, first let's go through what the Greenland colony was. There were three settlements: the Eastern settlement, the Middle settlement, and the Western settlement. They were actually basically diagonally north-south from each other, but geographically they were like this, and this. That's why they call them the Western, Middle, and Eastern settlements. But what happened in this slow path to death was in the Eastern settlement. It's actually fairly interesting and well, very interesting. I think it's the most interesting of the three sites. The Middle settlement, of course, just failed and the people dispersed between the two settlements. But what happened was, after this failing of an economic system where it became, non-existent anymore, in the Eastern settlement, they the last communique from there was in 1408. The priest there, the bishop, had married a Greenlander girl to an Icelander boy. And after the wedding, the Icelander boy was going back with his Greenlander girl to work for his father's shipping concern. And that's it. That's really the end of it. The birth rate, while it may or may not have kept up with the death rate, certainly they weren't keeping their young any longer. There were no opportunities there for the Greenlander boys, and the Greenlander girls were looking to get out as well. The Western settlement, though, is interesting. Its end begins in 1341, so well before the Eastern settlement goes under. A man by the name of Ivar Bardson came. The new bishop, couldn't get there, and so he was there to run affairs. And he came, and in 1341 to the Eastern settlement, and he was told of the great hardship that the Western settlement was having. So it was a little too late in the season. He couldn't leave, and so they waited until the spring, or as soon as the ice cleared the fjord. They got to the Western settlement with the Eastern settlement people, the ones that would come, and they sailed into the fjord, and they weren't greeted on the hilltops by the Eastern settlement people. There were farms all around. They got to the end. They didn't find a ship. They didn't even find any ships or partial ships in dry dock. There was no people. The Western settlement, all the houses were there. There was even a little wisp of smoke from a chimney in one of the farmhouses. They checked it out. There had been a fire in there within the past day. And all the houses were there, and all the animals were there. And so what happened was they felt like they were being watched. And so what Ivar Bardson did, I'm sure he was being motivated by the Eastern settlement people, he concluded that the Thule native culture, the Inuits, had taken the people or killed them. But there were no bodies around. No one found anything. There was nothing. There was no reason to come to that conclusion either, because the Thule culture, this is a terribly wrong assessment of the situation. The Thule culture would have taken the animals, at least all that they would have needed. They didn't understand an ownership culture. And this was the big problem between the two, is these cultural miscommunications. This is something that's happened all around the world, all through time. The Thule, they didn't understand ownership. The Norse, that was all they were: economics, ownership, the capitalism, I guess, before it really existed. And this is the great controversy of the Western settlement, is that no one knows where they have gone. In the next module, we're going to go through the archaeology of it and see where they may have possibly gone. There are some interesting sites on Baffin Island and in northern Labrador. So this will be interesting going into the second part of this Greenland and then into Vinland history. Thank you.